In the secluded reaches of East Texas, where vast plains meet dense pine forests, a series of camps once offered salvation to the condemned. From 1845 to 1881, over 300 individuals entered these redemption camps, seeking atonement for their sins. Only a few ever emerged alive. These survivors spoke in hushed tones of purification rituals, so brutal that death itself seemed a release. When federal investigators finally entered these camps in 1881, they uncovered something far more terrifying than mere religious extremism: a hidden graveyard holding the remains of nearly 200 victims, each showing signs of prolonged torment. However, it was the Damnation family's private ledgers that truly shocked the foundations of frontier justice, exposing an intricate criminal enterprise that had operated undetected for over 3 decades. Tonight, we reveal the full story of the most prolific serial killers in American frontier history, and the perverse salvation they offered to the desperate and damned. Before we delve into the reign of terror of the Damnation family masked as salvation, let me pose a question. This channel isn't for everyone. It's only for those courageous enough to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you are among the few who can handle such narratives, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which state you're listening from. The truth we are about to uncover will challenge your perceptions of faith, justice, and the true cost of redemption on the American frontier. The year was 1845, and Texas had just become the 28th state of the Union, following nearly a decade as an independent republic. The frontier was a vast, lawless territory where men and women fled their pasts, equally seeking either redemption or ruin. It was a place where a man's word was his bond, where justice often came swiftly, and where religious fervor burned as intensely as the summer sun along the dusty trails connecting scattered settlements across hundreds of miles. Rumors began to circulate about 3 brothers who offered a precious commodity to the damned: immediate salvation through the purification of the flesh. The Damnation family preacher Malachi, evangelist Cornelius, and prophet Jebediah arrived in Texas from Arkansas in early 1845, carrying letters of recommendation from various Baptist and Methodist congregations across the South. Preacher Malachi Damnation stood 6 feet tall, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to gaze directly into a man's soul. His black hair was always impeccably styled, and his voice possessed an otherworldly quality that could bring hardened killers to tears. At 35, he was the eldest and most charismatic of the 3 brothers, capable of delivering sermons that left audiences both terrified and invigorated. Evangelist Cornelius, 2 years younger, had an uncanny ability to discern the guilt etched on a person's face. He could pinpoint a man's specific sins with such accuracy that many believed he possessed supernatural powers. His slender build and hollow cheeks gave him an ascetic appearance, bolstering his reputation for spiritual insight. Cornelius specialized in what the brothers called confession extraction, compelling sinners to reveal their deepest secrets. The youngest brother, prophet Jebediah, claimed to receive visions directly from the Almighty. At 28, he was built like a blacksmith, with massive hands that he asserted were blessed with healing powers. His role was to oversee the physical aspects of purification, ensuring that each penitent endured the precise level of suffering their sins demanded. Together, they established a network of redemption camps along the most desolate stretches of East Texas, where cypress swamps met piney woods, and civilization felt like a distant memory. From the outside, the camps appeared unassuming, canvas tents arranged in perfect circles around rough wooden crosses, with a central fire pit where the brothers preached to gatherings of desperate souls. The clientele was precisely what one would expect on the frontier: cowboys escaping rustling charges, prostitutes seeking refuge from brutal brothel owners, gamblers burdened by insurmountable debt, murderers fleeing vigilante justice, and deserters from both the Mexican War and various Indian conflicts. However, The camps also attracted a surprising number of seemingly respectable citizens, merchants guilty of fraud, politicians avoiding corruption scandals, and even legitimate seekers of spiritual guidance who had heard of the brothers' reputation for miraculous transformations. The Damnation brothers preached a harsh gospel of immediate purification that resonated with the violent, unforgiving nature of frontier life. Sin must be burned away like chaff in the fire. Malachi with thunder, his voice echoing through the pines as flames flickered across his angular face. The flesh must suffer, so the spirit can soar to eternal glory. There are no shortcuts to salvation, only the narrow path of pain that leads to paradise. Their reputation for achieving miraculous transformations spread throughout Texas and into neighboring states. According to testimonials regularly published in frontier newspapers, men entered the camps as hardened sinners and emerged as new creations, gentle as lambs, pure as mountain snow, ready to spread the gospel to the farthest corners of the earth. It was on a sweltering August night in 1847 that the first troubling reports began to surface, though few paid much attention at the time. A cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell stumbled into the town of Marshall, Texas, barely alive. Speaking in terrified whispers about what he had witnessed at a redemption camp near the mysterious waters of Caddo Lake, Hartwell's appearance shocked those who had known him before his spiritual journey. Once a robust man in his 30s, he now appeared gaunt and prematurely aged, his hair having turned completely white. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and he would flinch violently at unexpected sounds. Most disturbing were his eyes. Once bright blue, they now held a hollow, haunted quality that suggested he had witnessed things no man should see. His story was fragmented, told between fits of trembling and moments of catatonic silence that could last for hours. According to the local pastor who took him in, Hartwell would wake each night screaming about the pit of purification and the screaming that never stopped. During his more lucid moments, he spoke of arriving at the camp seeking forgiveness for killing a man in a saloon fight over a disputed card game. They said the pain would cleanse my soul, Hartwell whispered to Pastor William Matthews, his voice barely audible even in the silence of the church. Brother Malachi looked into my eyes and told me exactly what I had done, not just the killing, but things I'd never told another living soul. He knew about the money I'd stolen from my mother before leaving Arkansas. He knew about the woman I'd left pregnant in New Orleans. He knew everything. According to Hartwell's account, the purification process began immediately upon arrival at the camp. New penitents were stripped of all possessions, including their clothes, and given rough, burlap robes. They were then required to confess not only the sin that had brought them to the camp, but every transgression they had ever committed, no matter how minor. Brother Cornelius would sit across from you with this ledger, Hartwell recalled, his voice taking on a monotone quality, as if reciting from memory. He'd write down everything you said, and if he suspected you were holding something back, Brother Yebediah would use his gifts to help you remember. Those hands of his, they could cause pain you couldn't imagine. The confession process could last days or even weeks, depending on the perceived honesty of the penitent. Only when the brothers were satisfied that every sin had been revealed would the physical purification begin. This started with a complete fast 7 days, with nothing but water, during which the penitent was forced to dig their own grave, as a symbol of their spiritual death. The hunger was nothing compared to what came next, Hartwell continued, his entire body beginning to shake as he recalled the memories. They called it the trial of fire, beatings with leather whips that had metal fragments sewn into them. Each lash was supposed to represent a specific sin being scourged from your flesh. But it went on for hours, sometimes days. But the physical torture was only the beginning. Hartwell described ritualistic burials where penitents were placed in the graves they had dug and covered with dirt, leaving only their faces exposed. They would remain buried for varying lengths of times, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, while The brothers prayed over them and declared their spiritual death complete. Some of them never came back up, Hartwell whispered, his eyes wide with remembered terror. Brother Malachi would stand over the graves and declare them perfectly purified, said they'd been called home to glory. But I saw their faces when they went under. There was no peace, only absolute terror. The most horrifying aspect of Hart's account was his description of those who didn't survive the purification process. According to him, the brothers maintained that death during purification was the ultimate blessing, proof that the individual had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. They had a special ceremony for the ones who died, Hartwell recalled. Brother Malachi would read from the Bible, while Brother Jebediah covered the grave, and then they'd plant a wooden cross and add the person's name to what they called the roll of the redeemed. They said these souls were the lucky ones. They'd skipped purgatory entirely. Local authorities and Marshall initially dismissed Hartwell's story as the ravings of a man broken by guilt and the testimonials followed a remarkably consistent pattern. A desperate sinner would arrive at a redemption camp, undergo the purification process, and emerge as a completely new person. Within weeks of their transformation, they would feel called to missionary work in remote territories, California, Oregon, the Rocky Mountains, or deep into Indian territory. Their final letters to family members spoke of their overwhelming desire to bring salvation to the unreached, often requesting financial support for their evangelical missions. Yet, for those who looked closely, there were troubling patterns that suggested all was not as it seemed. The redemption camps moved frequently, never staying in one location for more than 6 months. The brothers explained this as following God's calling to reach new populations of sinners. But it made tracking their activities nearly impossible for law enforcement agencies that were already stretched thin across the vast frontier. More disturbing were the accounts of families who sent wayward sons or daughters to the camps, only to receive letters months later informing them that their loved ones had been so transformed by the experience that they had felt called to missionary work in distant territories. These family members were never seen or heard from again, but the Damnation brothers always had explanations, and often forged letters to account for their absence. Mrs. Eleanor Westbrook of New Orleans became one of the first to question the brothers' claims when her son Thomas, a gambling addict with mounting debts, disappeared after entering a damnation camp near Shreveport in 1849. Initially, she received regular letters describing his spiritual transformation and growing desire to spread the gospel in California. The letters contained enough personal details to convince her of their authenticity, and Thomas even requested money to support his missionary work. At first I was overjoyed, Mrs. Westbrook would later tell investigators. Thomas had been heading down a dark path, and these letters suggested he had found salvation. But something about the handwriting bothered me. It looked like Thomas's writing, but there were subtle differences the way he formed certain letters, the phrases he used. I began to suspect someone was copying his style. When Mrs. Westbrook hired a private investigator to locate her son in California, the results were deeply troubling. None of the churches or missions in the areas Thomas claimed to be working had any record of him. The addresses he provided in his letters were either non-existent or occupied by people who had never heard of Thomas Westbrook or his missionary work. Similar stories began to emerge from across the region. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a traveling physician who had treated several survivors of the camps, began to notice a disturbing pattern in their symptoms. They exhibited signs of severe trauma. She would later testify before a federal tribunal. Not the peaceful countenance of the spiritually redeemed, but the hollow stare of those who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. The few survivors who did return to civilization were indeed changed men and women, but not in the way the brothers claimed. They spoke little, startled at sudden noises, and seemed to carry a burden of knowledge too terrible to share. Most disturbing was their universal reluctance to discuss their time at the camps. as if bound by some unholy oath of silence. Dr. Thornton documented several cases that particularly troubled her. Jacob Miller, a former outlaw who had survived the purification process, displayed symptoms she had only seen in soldiers who had witnessed the worst atrocities of war. He would wake screaming about the pit and the ceremony of ascension, she noted in her journal. When pressed for details, he would only say that some forms of salvation came at too high a price. Another survivor, a woman named Sarah Colby, who had sought redemption after abandoning her children to pursue a life of prostitution, returned to her family a broken shell of her former self. She would spend hours staring at nothing, her sister Mary reported. Sometimes she would whisper prayers, but they weren't normal prayers. She would ask God to forgive her for the things she had seen, not the things she had done. Perhaps most telling was the case of Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to observe the Damnation brothers' methods with an eye toward incorporating their techniques into his own ministry. Hawkins had entered the camp as a spiritual mentor and observer, not as a penitent, yet he emerged just as traumatized as any other survivor. There are forms of evil that masquerade as righteousness, Hawkins told Dr. Thornton during one of their sessions. I went seeking inspiration for my ministry and found something that shook my faith to its core. The brothers are not servants of God. They are something else entirely, something that uses our deepest spiritual needs as weapons against us. When pressed for specifics, Hawkins would only say that the true purpose of the camps had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. He refused to elaborate, claiming that speaking the truth would only endanger others who might be tempted to investigate. The pattern of mysterious disappearances and traumatized survivors continued throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s. However, the chaos of the Civil War provided perfect cover for the Damnation brothers' activities. With entire populations displaced and communication systems disrupted, it became even easier for people to vanish without explanation. Yet, the end of the war brought new challenges for the brothers and new opportunities for those seeking to expose their crimes. In the spring of 1879, nearly 15 years after the conflict's end, a young Texas Ranger named Captain James Morrison began investigating reports of missing persons throughout East Texas. Morrison was a methodical man with a background in military intelligence, and he noticed something that others had missed, a pattern of disappearances that seemed to follow the movement of the redemption camps, like a shadow across the frontier. Morrison had been assigned to the case after receiving a formal complaint from Senator Charles Whitman of Louisiana, whose nephew had disappeared after entering a damnation camp near the Texas border. Unlike previous investigations, which had been conducted by local sheriffs with limited resources and jurisdiction, Morrison had the authority and funding to conduct a comprehensive multi-state investigation. There's something here that doesn't add up, Morrison wrote in his initial report to Ranger headquarters in Austin. I've documented over 60 missing persons cases in the past 3 years alone, all connected to these redemption camps. That's not counting the cases from earlier years or other states where records are incomplete. Morrison's investigation led him to interview dozens of families who had lost contact with relatives after they entered the camps. The stories were remarkably similar. Loved ones would seek redemption at a damnation camp. Correspondence would continue for several weeks describing their spiritual transformation, then abruptly cease with a final letter explaining their calling to missionary work in remote locations. The ranger's suspicions deepened when he attempted to verify these missionary claims. Letters sent to the addresses provided were invariably returned as undeliverable. Churches and missions in the territories where the converts had allegedly gone to serve had no record of their arrival. Most damning, Morrison discovered that several of the testimonial letters, supposedly written by grateful families, contained identical phrases and even identical grammatical errors. Someone is manufacturing these testimonials, Morrison concluded in a confidential memo to his superior. The question is whether we're dealing with fraud, kidnapping, or something worse. Morrison's breakthrough came when he encountered a man named Tobias Fletcher in a tavern in Jefferson, Texas. Fletcher was drunk and rambling, but his story was coherent enough to send chills down Morrison's spine. Fletcher claimed to have worked as a gravedigger and general laborer for the Damnation brothers for nearly 2 years in the mid-1870s. "I thought I was helping with the Lord's work," Fletcher whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for his bottle. "Brother Malachi told me I was blessed to assist in the purification of souls. But some of those graves weren't for show. Some stayed filled permanent. He'd pray over them and declare another soul saved for eternity. But I knew what was really buried down there." According to Fletcher, his duties included not only digging the symbolic graves used in purification rituals, but also disposing of the bodies of those who ascended during purification. The brothers maintained that these individuals had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. But Fletcher had seen enough bodies to know the difference between natural death and murder. "The way Brother Jebediah would work with his hands," Fletcher continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He claimed it was healing, but I saw what those hands could do. He could make a man suffer for days without killing him, drawing out every bit of information about family, money, property. Then when they had everything they needed, he'd finish the job." Fletcher described a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple murder. The brothers would extract detailed information about their victims' assets, family connections, and business dealings during the prolonged torture sessions. They would then use this information to forge correspondence with family members, often requesting money for fictional missionary work while providing plausible explanations for why the missionary couldn't return home or meet in person. The money kept coming, Fletcher revealed. Families would send funds to support their loved ones' work spreading the gospel. The brothers had it set up so the money would be forwarded through multiple intermediaries, impossible to trace back to them. Some families kept sending money for years, never knowing their sons and daughters were dead and buried in unmarked graves. When Morrison pressed Fletcher for details about the location of these graves, the man's demeanor changed completely. Terror replaced drunken bravado, and he began looking around the tavern, as if expecting the Damnation brothers to materialize from the shadows. "They got eyes everywhere," Fletcher stammered, suddenly much more sober than he had appeared moments before. "People who asked too many questions about the brothers. They got a way of disappearing too. I shouldn't have said nothing. God help me, I shouldn't have said nothing." Fletcher fled the tavern that night and was never seen again. Some said he'd headed for California. Others claimed he'd been found dead in the swamps near Caddo Lake. Morrison suspected the latter, but Fletcher had provided enough information to narrow his search to a specific area near the Louisiana border, where the brothers were reportedly operating their latest camp. The information Fletcher had provided was both valuable and deeply disturbing. Armed with this intelligence and a growing body of evidence, Morrison knew it was time to take decisive action. He assembled a small team of trusted rangers and set out for the region near Caddo Lake, where the Damnation family was reportedly operating their latest camp. The journey took them through some of the most remote and forbidding terrain in Texas, dense forests where the canopy blocked out the sun, and cypress swamps that seemed to swallow sound itself. Morrison's team consisted of 3 other rangers: Sergeant Bill Crawford, a grizzled veteran of the Indian Wars; Corporal Miguel Santos, a former vaquero with unmatched tracking skills; and Private David Thompson, a young man whose sharp eyes and steady nerves had earned him a reputation as an exceptional marksman. Each man had been chosen for his discretion, as well as his skills. Morrison couldn't risk word of their investigation reaching the wrong ears. As they approached the area, Morrison's team began to notice disturbing signs that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the region. The local wildlife seemed unusually scarce. Even the insects that normally plagued travelers in the humid East Texas climate were noticeably absent. The few settlers they encountered warned them away from the area, speaking of unholy ground and cursed soil where nothing would grow properly. "Ain't nothing natural about that place," warned an old trapper named Ezekiel Marsh, whom they encountered at a trading post near Marshall. "Been hunting these woods for 30 years, and I can tell you that land near the lake ain't right. Animals won't go near it, and the few that do come back changed, if they come back at all." Marsh's description of the area matched reports Morrison had gathered from other sources. Multiple witnesses described a section of forest where the trees grew in strange, twisted patterns, and where the normal sounds of wildlife fell silent. Some attributed this to Indian burial grounds or other supernatural causes, but Morrison suspected a more mundane explanation. The presence of large quantities of decomposing organic matter could certainly affect local ecosystems. The team made camp several miles from the reported location of the redemption site, planning to observe the Damnation brothers' activities before making any move. Morrison's strategy was to gather irrefutable evidence of criminal activity before confronting the brothers directly. He knew that their religious credentials and reputation for good works would make it difficult to convince a jury without overwhelming proof of wrongdoing. On their first night, the Rangers heard distant sounds that confirmed their worst suspicions. Carried on the night wind from the direction of the camp came the unmistakable sounds of human suffering, screaming, pleading, and what sounded like religious chanting in languages none of them recognized. It wasn't the cry of someone in physical pain, Morrison would later write in his official report. It was the sound of a soul in absolute torment, pleading for mercy that would never come. The worst part was how it would stop abruptly, then start again hours later, as if the suffering was being deliberately prolonged. The screaming continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes accompanied by the sound of digging and what appeared to be some form of ritual ceremony. When dawn broke, Morrison and his men found the courage to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance of the area. What they discovered in the woods surrounding the camp would challenge everything they thought they knew about the scope of the damnation. Families' crimes, fresh graves dotted the landscape like a macabre garden, far too many to be explained as symbolic elements of religious ritual. Morrison counted over 60 graves that appeared to have been dug within the past year alone, each marked with a simple wooden cross bearing only a number. But it was the smell that convinced Morrison they had found something genuinely horrific. Despite the brothers' apparent efforts to manage their burial ground, the unmistakable odor of decomposition hung heavy in the humid air. Private Thompson, who had served as a battlefield medic during the Indian conflicts, confirmed more suspicions. "That's the smell of a lot of bodies, Captain," Thompson reported grimly. "Fresh ones, and old ones too. Whatever's happening here, it's been going on for a long time." As the Rangers moved closer to the camp itself, they began to hear sounds that made their blood run cold. From the largest tent came the rhythmic sound of metal striking flesh, accompanied by a man's agonized screaming and what sounded like religious incantations. The voice delivering the incantations was calm, almost conversational, creating a horrifying contrast with the obvious suffering of the victim. Morrison realized they were witnessing an active torture session, probably part of the purification process Fletcher had described. The Ranger captain faced a terrible decision: intervene immediately and risk losing the evidence needed to expose the full scope of the brothers' crimes, or allow the torture to continue while they gathered intelligence. The decision was made for him when the screaming suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow even more disturbing than the sounds of suffering. Morrison knew they had just witnessed a murder, and any hope of saving that particular victim was gone. Now, their priority had to be gathering evidence and preventing future atrocities. Using hand signals, Morrison deployed his men around the perimeter of the camp. What they observed over the next several hours would provide the foundation for one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in frontier history. The brothers operated with the efficiency of a well-established business, their activities following a precise schedule that suggested years of experience and refinement. What Morrison and his team witnessed during their surveillance would soon lead them deeper into the investigation, revealing layer after layer of criminal sophistication that defied everything they thought they knew about frontier crime. Team documented a horrific routine that revealed the true nature of the Damnation brothers' operation. Each morning began with what appeared to be a legitimate religious service, complete with hymn singing and Bible readings. New arrivals would participate in these services, probably believing they had found genuine spiritual guidance. But as the day progressed, the facade of religious devotion would gradually give way to something far more sinister. Individual counseling sessions would begin, during which Brother Cornelius would extract detailed confessions from the penitents. These sessions often lasted for hours, and the Rangers could hear increasingly desperate pleading from inside the confession tent. Brother Cornelius has a gift for knowing exactly what people are hiding, Morrison noted in his surveillance log, but I'm beginning to suspect this divine insight comes from more earthly sources. Prolonged interrogation combined with psychological manipulation and probably torture. The brothers had perfected a system for extracting not only confessions, but detailed information about their victims' financial assets, family connections, and anything else that might prove profitable. They would use this information to craft convincing forged correspondence with family members, often continuing these fictional relationships for months or even years after the victim's death. Private Thompson, who had positioned himself closest to the camp, reported observing Brother Yebediah's healing sessions, which were actually torture sessions designed to break down the victim's resistance. He's got a collection of tools that would make a Spanish inquisitor proud, Thompson whispered during one of their nightly briefings. And he knows exactly how to use them to cause maximum pain without killing too quickly. The most disturbing aspect of the brothers' operation was its systematic nature. They had clearly developed their methods over many years, refining their techniques for extracting information, forging documents, and disposing of bodies. The camp Morrison's team was observing was obviously not their first. It showed all the signs of a well-established operation that had been repeated many times in many locations. On the second night of their surveillance, the Rangers witnessed what the brothers called a ceremony of ascension, their euphemism for murder. A penitent who had apparently undergone several days of torture was brought to the center of the camp, where Brother Malachi delivered a lengthy sermon about the blessing of spiritual purification. The victim, barely conscious and showing obvious signs of prolonged abuse, was then ceremonially released from earthly bonds by Brother Yebediah. "They're not killing in a fit of religious madness," Morrison wrote in his report. "This is cold, calculated murder, performed with the precision of a business transaction." The religious element, Morrison suspected, was merely a disguise for a far more nefarious purpose. After 2 nights and a day of continuous surveillance, Captain Morrison had seen enough. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a chilling picture of systematic murder and fraud. He knew that any further delay would only endanger more innocent lives. It was time to act. The raid and its aftermath. In the morning of August 3, 1881, under the dim light of dawn, Captain Morrison's small team of Texas Rangers launched their raid on the Damnation family's camp. Their approach was swift and silent, catching the brothers and their few loyal followers completely by surprise. The element of surprise was critical, as Morrison wanted to capture them alive to face justice. Sergeant Crawford and Private Thompson moved to secure Preacher Malachi and Prophet Yebediah, who were in the main tent. Cornelius, the evangelist, was found in a smaller tent, meticulously updating his ledger of confessions. The brothers offered no resistance, their composure unnervingly calm even as they were placed in irons. Their followers, a handful of desperate men who seemed as much victims as accomplices, quickly surrendered. A horrific discovery with the camp secured, Morrison's team began a thorough search. What they found confirmed their darkest suspicions and surpassed their most grim expectations. The pit of purification Hartwell had described was indeed real, a series of shallow, crudely dug pits containing skeletal remains. The main redemption tent, far from being a place of spiritual solace, was a chamber of horrors, equipped with an array of instruments clearly designed for torture. The Damnation family's ledgers, confiscated from Cornelius, proved to be the most damning evidence. These weren't religious records, but meticulously kept accounts of their victims' lives, their past sins, their financial assets, family connections, and even details of their correspondence. Each entry ended with a chilling note of ascension and a record of the funds extracted from their unsuspecting families. The grim task of exhuming the graves began. Over the next several days, federal investigators uncovered the remains of nearly 200 individuals. Forensic examination revealed signs of prolonged torture, consistent with Fletcher's testimony and Dr. Thornton's earlier observations. Many bodies showed evidence of extreme dehydration and malnourishment, indicating extended periods of deprivation. The sheer scale of the cemetery was staggering, silent proof of decades of undetected killings. Justice on the frontier. The trial of the Damnation brothers was swift and sensational, dominating newspaper headlines across the nation. Preacher Malachi, evangelist Cornelius, and prophet Jebediah maintained their eerie composure throughout, asserting their innocence and claiming divine sanction for their actions. They argued that those who died had achieved ultimate salvation, a spiritual calling that federal law couldn't comprehend. However, the overwhelming evidence presented by Captain Morrison and his team, combined with the chilling testimony of a few surviving victims who were finally willing to speak, left no doubt of their guilt. Tobias Fletcher's detailed account, though he was never found, was corroborated by the ledgers and the condition of the bodies. Dr. Thornton's medical findings provided scientific backing for the claims of torture. The jury, comprised of frontier citizens hardened by life but still valuing justice, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The Damnation brothers were sentenced to hang, a fitting end for those who had so cruelly exploited faith and hope for their own twisted gain. A lingering legacy. The hangings of the Damnation brothers in late 1881 marked the end of their horrific reign, yet their story left a profound and unsettling legacy on the American frontier. It forced communities to confront the dark underbelly of unchecked religious fervor and the ease with which malevolence could hide behind the guise of righteousness. Captain James Morrison, lauded as a hero, continued his work as a Texas Ranger, forever changed by the horrors he had witnessed. The redemption camps, once symbols of false hope, became stark reminders of the vulnerability of desperate souls. Even today, in the remote hills of East Texas, whispers of the Damnation family persist. The tale serves as a chilling testament to the dangers of blind faith and the enduring human capacity for both good and unspeakable evil. It's a reminder that true salvation rarely comes without a cost, but never at the price of another's humanity.